Welcome, everybody. I'm Joel Ladd from the Center for Student Development. And, yeah, I know it. I think he's working on it. There we go. Some of you may be familiar with the Center for Student Development and some aren't, so I want to briefly tell you our mission is to help you succeed, professionally, vocationally, academically. So one of the ways we primarily do that, actually, is through workshops such as this. We offer all sorts of training workshops. Outside on the table, you'll see a Lucite stand that has a calendar in it. And I'd urge you to take a look at, pull out a calendar and see what all is coming up. One of the things I'd like to highlight coming up is Professional Image Week. Our annual event starts next week. And one event of that in particular I want to make sure you're aware of is the Etiquette Dinner. The dinner is led every year. In recent years, we've been very fortunate to have Cheryl Eberly, who's a former White House aide, who will be leading that. And she does a wonderful job, and there's a wonderful, excellent 5-course dinner offered by Founders Inn along with that. The sign-up needs to be accomplished by the 17th, so your deadline's coming up quickly. If you haven't already signed up for that, you'll want to do that quickly if you want to get in on that. Let's open in prayer. Father, we're so grateful that you have our days ordained for us. We ask that this evening would be a time that you equip us, that you challenge our thinking, and that you challenge our minds. We ask your blessing on Professor Duane as he speaks to us this evening. We ask that you would really ignite the passions and the interests and the words that he's prepared. Amen. Professor Duane has been on the law faculty since 1991. His specialties include law practice and evidence, and probably many of you are familiar with him from those classes and others. His professional competence is manifest in many publications, many conferences, many other times where he's presented. His interest in rhetoric, he tells me, actually extends at least back to his high school days when he and a friend won the National Debate Championship. He's a man of ready wit and personal humility. Please join me in welcoming Professor James Duane. Who is expecting a longer introduction.
That was longer than I deserved. Welcome. Good evening. What a pleasant surprise to see so many of you in the evening, when there's so many better things that could be done, but we'll do our best to make this time worthwhile. I want to talk about partial birth abortion. You've all heard about the process. What do you think about it? Partial birth abortion in many quarters has been given a bad name. That's unjustifiable, as it is unnecessary. Because, in fact, the truth remains that, as controversial as the subject may be, our nation's long-standing and robust constitutional commitment to a woman's inviolable right of procreative privacy is probably the surest and the truest evidence that we have not yet and may never yet break faith with the solemn undertaking of the founders of this nation, that this was a nation conceived in liberty, the liberty of every individual, to choose for himself or for herself how to live their life in relationship with their own God or their conception of God. Partial birth abortion is a medically sanctioned procedure, supervised carefully and closely by trained medical professionals, through which a woman, at her own choice, is able to arrange the elective evacuation of the contents of the uterus in a manner that is scientifically designed and controlled to assure an absolute minimum of any likelihood of serious infection or further emotional or psychic damage to a woman who at that point in her life is already likely subject to perhaps the most precarious emotional state she will ever know. You believe that? I don't. I guess some of that is true. But then again, on the other hand, it's also true that partial birth abortion is a villainous and savage act of brutality that has darkened the soul of this nation. It is one of the most brutal acts in recorded archaeological history ever perpetrated by any society. A little child ruthlessly yanked from the womb, ironically and perversely in the name of women's rights, is just as likely as not to be a girl herself. A little girl who will never know the pleasure of holding her daughters and her granddaughters because their lives will be snuffed out in an instant. When some man, a predator who will never know her, and he will never know her name, he does not want to know her name, and he does not want to see her face. He yanks her out violently from the warmth of the mother's womb and jams a fork into the back of her skull. Her brain is then sucked out of the back of her head while her blood is splattered all over the table and the floor. She is not thrown out with the trash. She is thrown out like a piece of trash, unceremoniously disposed of. No one will ever weep at her grave. Her grave will never be marked. And it's only by the grace of God that her carcass will not be savagely taken apart by wild dogs or other predators. Well, now that you mention it, now that you look at it that way, it sort of gives you another perspective on the whole subject, doesn't it? Well, there's rhetoric for you. Two very different ways of describing the, I guess you might say, the same phenomenon. As I was going through the first time describing the whole procedure, what sort of emotions, what sort of reactions was I evincing in all of you? Probably surprise on the part of some of you who thought, I didn't come here to hear this. Not to Regent nor to this room. And then again, when I began to describe it in altogether different terms, I suppose you were suddenly a whole lot less comfortable, weren't you, than a few minutes earlier, even though I was describing essentially the same thing, from a different perspective, laden with all kinds of different language. Did you find that the two different descriptions had different effects on you, viscerally, emotionally, intellectually? I suspect it might have. If not, then you can leave now. Because if not, then I've got nothing to share with you. This is what rhetoric is all about. You go, girl. This is what rhetoric is all about, in a nutshell. Let me, I trust that we can go to the next. Yeah, excellent. I've been asked, why me? I don't know. Me of all people. I have no formal training. Don't get your hopes up. I suppose I should begin with a few suitable disclaimers. I have no formal training in the study of classical rhetoric. I was a philosophy major and then a law school student, and I guess in a way I've been something like a professional communicator for a long time, having been a trial lawyer before I was a teacher, and now a father. So in all these different contexts, I'm accustomed to talking until I'm blue in the face to people who don't really listen. But I have no formal training in the subject of rhetoric, but I suppose, nor do I have any special aptitude or flair for the subject or the art myself, but I've watched, as we all have, with admiration from a bit of a distance, from those who seem to be possessed with an uncanny ability to communicate or to persuade or to inspire, to exhort with their words, and I've noticed a few things. So here I am like you, another amateur, to share a few things that I've noticed about the way in which good speakers sometimes have a way of moving us. Before I say anything else, though, to give credit where credit is due, I will happily concede that the most important thing I have to share with you tonight doesn't even come from me. You've all got a copy, by the way, of the outline. I trust it's been made available. I don't recommend that you try to read along on there. It'll be a distraction to you, but you're welcome. On that outline, I've included the websites of two fabulous resources. There we go. The first one, AmericanRhetoric.com. I am not kidding. I'm not being facetious when I say for many, if not most of you, you would do well to throw your TV set out to the trash tonight and devote the time you used to spend watching the TV to listening to the speeches that are available on this website. Literally hundreds. It's called Great American Rhetoric, but actually, and most of the speeches on this website are by great Americans, no particularly good reason. But there are also transcripts of other great speeches given by non-Americans and people from all over the world, from every age, although most of the speeches are from Americans in the past century. Martin Luther King, Ronald Reagan, John F. Kennedy, you name it, politicians, political leaders, others. You can read their speeches, you can listen to them online, and I'm quite certain that if you spent a couple hours, heck, if you spent 30 minutes listening to this website, listening to some of the greatest speakers of our and earlier generations, it'll do you more good than sitting around listening to me if it's one or the other. I'd rather have you leave now and listen to this if you don't have time for both. But if you can stay, I do both. I do recommend with all my heart that you make the time to listen to this website. There isn't much on television these days, and sadly not even nearly enough on radio these days, that will really do much to encourage you, by example, to become better speakers than you probably are now. But this website just might do it. It's certainly done me some good, and I'm not done with it yet. The other website here, also there's an outstanding discussion of the theoretical literature on the elements of rhetoric. This is put together by the rhetoric department at a prominent university, and it's well maintained, it's well constructed, so if you want to do a little bit more reading about the fundamentals of rhetoric as understood by those in the know, this would be a great place to look for additional help. There you go. Having said that, let me share with you a couple of fundamentals. Don't get your hopes up. There's nothing that I or anybody else can do in an hour or thereabouts to automatically transform you into a great speaker. If it were that easy, I'd be a great speaker myself by now. But there's a few fundamental principles that I have drawn from personal observation that I wanted to share with you and discuss with you. And I want to welcome you, all of you, as the Spirit leads, to interrupt with questions or comments or feedback. I'll give you a couple of opportunities even if you don't want them. But before you start speaking, there's a couple of things, obviously, that you've got to do. You've got to do good speaking, like good writing, of course. Rhetoric is not just about speaking, it's about writing, too. But good writing and good speaking requires, of course, that you stop first, as obvious as this may sound, and give a bit of thought to your audience and to your purposes. Think about who your audience will include. What are their limits? What are their expectations, their assumptions, and their interests? This is crucial, frankly. If you're going before an audience that you know is generally likely to agree with you before you begin on the subject of abortion, for example, you'll talk about it, I presume, in a different way and for a different reason, as opposed to an audience that might be of a much more mixed view on the subject. I say you need to know your audience's limits. Well, limits of every sort. No offense intended. We all have limits, me, just like you. Limits on the extent of our training, on the extent of our education, on the sorts of things that we want to hear about, on the nature of the arrangement, whether, in fact, for example, it's a captive audience. You are not a captive audience. I could take a little bit more liberty with you because you're here at your own choice. So I can go ahead and be a little bit more adventuresome and a little bit more opinionated than I would ordinarily take the liberty of being in front of a group of students who were required to sit at my feet. Also, in terms of limits, we need to be frank and talk about time limits. Time is, I gather, it seems more precious to most of us these days than perhaps to any other generation before. And with that, of course, concomitantly comes limited attention spans, right? If you were to ask jurors or students or parishioners to list their number one complaint of trial lawyers and professors and clergymen, respectively, very often at the top of the list would be, oh, great preacher, great talker, great professor, but boy, he just talks too long. Takes too long to make his point. Wish he'd get to point number 2 pretty quick. I know what you're thinking. I'm almost there. But you need to reckon with these things and to think about them in advance. If in our day and age, perhaps more than ever before, time limits are also something that has been designated for you. If you're a trial lawyer, these days more than in prior generations, you'll frequently find that the judge will tell you in advance, counsel, you've got X minutes for opening statement. You've got so many minutes to finish your class. I've been given an assignment to finish tonight by a certain time. And you'll be delighted to discover that I won't interrupt you halfway through by asking you, now, when was I supposed to finish? What was the time? I made it my business to find out before I started how much time I had, and I brought a watch with me to make sure that I would get it done. Good speakers always do that. You should, too. It's not that hard to do. Also, of course, think a lot and think hard about what your purpose is. Why talk to this group? What's the point anyway? Oh, sure, on one level, that's obvious enough, right? Oh, I intend to talk about why I am pro-life, for example. Speaking of abortion, this is the only commercial interruption we'll have all night. If we could just have an aside, I would hate with all my heart to imagine that any of you someday, God forbid, might suddenly find yourself in the near or distant future where your view of abortion was one way or another affected by my attempted eloquent disquisition of the so-called pro-choice perspective at the beginning of today's talk, which was filled with lies, chock full of lies. Abortion is not the answer. It is never the answer. If you find yourself pregnant someday unexpectedly in an unwanted pregnancy, as other Regent students have done before you, you will not be the first. Don't panic. Don't make a mistake. Don't rush and think, I've got to get an abortion because I've got no other choice. This guy that I thought loved me is giving me no other choice. He's putting pressure on me. I don't know where else to live. I can't afford to live anywhere else. I can't afford this baby. That's all wrong. There is another option. There's always another choice. I can find parents who will adopt that baby for you. If they won't, I will. I will find somebody who will put you up during the course of the pregnancy. If they don't, I will. You can come and live with me, rent-free. Okay, I assure you of that. There's another way. There's a better way. Don't choose abortion. Not again. And don't go getting pregnant just because you can't afford your rent next semester and you want to live with a professor. Okay. All right. Let's take a look. That's the end of our commercial interruption. I just didn't want to be misunderstood on that particular subject. I've known and loved far too many women whose lives were ruined by this so-called exercise of what was supposedly in the best interests in the short term. Well, Edward Wilson is one of the most famous professors at Harvard University. He's one of the university professors there. He wrote an article that just appeared in Harvard Magazine, December 2005. If you didn't bring your copy with you, I brought a quote from the article. He called his article Intelligent Evolution. Look at this with me, read it with me, aloud if you wish, depending on your denominational preferences. And what's his purpose in writing this, for goodness sake? I mean, his point is plain enough, for sure. This guy, as you may already know from experience, is one of the most prominent and outspoken proponents, and has always been, of our modern notions of evolutionary theory. Here's what he writes. It is surpassingly strange that half of all Americans recently polled not only do not believe in evolution, imagine, go figure that, by natural selection, but do not believe in evolution at all. Americans are certainly capable of belief and with rock-like conviction if it originates in religious dogma. Notice that interesting choice of adjective. He doesn't say firm and abiding, consistent and staunch. Rock-like, he calls it, which implies the same notions of steadfastness, but it also implies dumb as a rock, unthinking, uncritical, rock-like conviction if it originates in religious dogma. Yet biologists, particularly those statured by the peer review and publication of substantial personal research on the subject in leading journals of science, are unanimous in concluding that evolution is a fact. Many who accepted the fact of evolution cannot, however, on religious grounds, accept the operation of blind chance and the absence of divine purpose, implicit in natural selection. They support the alternative explanation of intelligent design. The reasoning they offer is not based on evidence, but on the lack of it. The formulation of intelligent design is a default argument, advanced in support of a non sequitur. So it's, okay, well, we see his point, in a sense, is obvious enough. He thinks evolution is a settled fact. But to whom is he writing? Do you think that he's writing this article in the hopes that it may persuade some folks who are sitting on the fence? Or that it may bring over to the side of truth those crazy rock-like cretins who actually believe in intelligent design? By the way, I'm one of them. I'm not ashamed to say so. And this is all unadulterated bunk, and I'm not ashamed to say that either, but we haven't got time to go into that tonight. No, of course. What do you think his purpose is? Any ideas? For what purpose do you think he's writing here? I think it's obvious enough. I mean, your opinion's no worse than mine. What do you think he's trying to do here? To what audience is he speaking, and what is he trying to get them to do that they aren't already doing, maybe? Yeah, any ideas? Any guesses? Yes?
He's probably rallying the troops within his own camp.
Right. Well, sure. He's doing at least that much. I think he's rallying the troops with his own camp. He's trying to buck up their certitude, their confidence, their willingness, like everybody else in the tale of the Emperor's New Clothes, to go out in public and say, oh, yeah, I see it. I see the evidence. It's right there. What other effect do you think this is calculated to have? There are members, some of them outspoken members of the scientific community, as a matter of fact, who actually believe that intelligent design is scientifically valid. And there are some others, highly educated and influential members of society, in this culture and in every culture in generations past, who also believe that the rather plain evidence of our own senses clearly enough confirms that there must have been some intelligent work here in the creation of this world. I'm one of those. I'm not ashamed to say so. What is this writing style? What effect do you think this writing style was intended to have on people like us? Yes? Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about it. He's trying to shame them into what? Into doing what or not doing what? That's exactly right. I mean, again, my guess is no better than yours, but I think it's exactly right. I regard this as a form of rhetorical terrorism. That's what it is. It's rhetorical terrorism. He isn't even pretending to be open-minded. He isn't even pretending that the words he's choosing are designed to try to gently nudge some of us closer to the direction of the way that he's thinking. He accuses his opponents of thinking like rocks and of disregarding the unanimous way of the scientific evidence that is accepted by everybody who's statured in scholarly edited peer journals. It's a highfalutin way of saying, if you don't agree with me, you're stupid or uneducated or probably both. Which, by the way, is a famous quote you may recognize from the words of one outspoken proponent of evolutionary theory. He's actually come out and said that, famous scientist. I think writing like this, and we're seeing more of it all the time, is designed to shame us, some of us, and scare us into not raising your hand, being afraid to register a gentle dissent. Because he's making it plain enough. He's thrown down the gauntlet. He said, I have no truck for those of you who don't see the things the way I do already. And is there anyone who would have the audacity to raise their hand or write a letter to the editor to say that you disagree with me after an article like this? Obviously, he hopes that you won't. Here's another form of writing, another writing style. This is Ann Coulter. And for goodness sake, even before you read what she wrote, look at the article. Look at the title of the article. If you know anything about Ann Coulter, you probably already know her purpose. It's always the same. The title of her article is The New Idea for Abortion Party, Aid the Enemy. This is obviously, she's referring to the Democrats. She calls them the abortion party in this column. And here's what she writes about them. This was also from November 2005. I got this off her website. You can too. Fed up with being endlessly told the American people have turned against the war in Iraq, Republicans asked the Democrats to show what they had in their hand and vote on a resolution to withdraw the troops. By a vote of 403 to 3, the House of Representatives wasn't willing to bet that the American people want to pull out of Iraq. This vote also marked the first time in recent history that the Democrats did not respond to getting their butts kicked by demanding a recount. What are we to make of the fact that, as we now know, the Democrats don't even want to withdraw troops from Iraq? Before the vote, Democrats could at least defend themselves from sedition by pleading stupidity. Now we know that they don't believe what they are saying about the war. There is no plausible explanation for the Democrats' behavior other than that they long to see U.S. troops shot, humiliated, and driven from the field of battle. They fill the airwaves with treason, but when called on to vote on withdrawing troops, disavow their own public statements. These people are not only traitors, they are gutless traitors. Well, close quote. Okay, Ann, thanks. To whom do you suppose Ann is preaching? The choir or the unsaved? Obviously. And for what purpose? Did you think that when she wrote these words she harbored any crazy, naive optimism that just maybe her thoughtful disquisition just might persuade a few Democrats to change their colors? Join the Republican Party to see the hypocrisy and the stupidity and the treachery of their ways? Of course, she couldn't care less. I mean, for goodness sake, this is the woman who's the author of a famous book titled How to Talk to Liberals If You Must. She's obviously preaching to the choir. And for what purpose? What do you suppose she's hoping that her readers will do as a result of having read this? I mean, on one level, it's true enough and clear enough that her purpose is to entertain and to provoke a little laughter among folks who probably will agree with her already. And anything else, though, besides entertainment? Yeah, there's something else here that she's hoping to do. What is it? Yes?
Provoke the Republicans to action, conservatives to fight against the liberals who are against the war?
That's exactly right. Yeah, sure. In her own way, she's trying to rally the troops, you might say. Anybody here ever listen to a coach yell at them at halftime? Not such a different idea. It's sort of like a slightly more sophisticated version of what ordinarily happens during halftime pep talks when the team is behind. The coach doesn't go in there and talk about, well, you know, in fairness, it stands to reason we're down by 7. That other team is playing a good game, and they've got a fine quarterback. And they don't talk about that way. You know what they say. I can't repeat it in mixed company. But the coach tells you in no uncertain terms that this is an outrage. It doesn't make any sense that those blank blanks over there are beating us. And I want you blank blanks to get out there and blank, 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 blank. It's all the same idea. It's preacher to the choir for the sake of inspiring them to take action, to get them worked up. Because your words can do a lot of different things. They can exhort, they can inspire, they can encourage, they can sedate, they can convict, they can persuade, or at least they can be designed to try to do all those things. And these are a couple of examples of what I mean when I say you've got to stop before you get started and think first, well, what's my purpose? Once you've given some thought to that, all right, you've thought about your audience, you've thought about your purpose, now it's time to start talking. The remaining points on my outline that we'll be talking about tonight are what I regard as the most fundamental elements of a particular form of rhetoric. And for want of a better title, I'll make one up. I'll call it persuasive rhetoric. Right? Tragically, it does appear to me as an amateur student of world history that there's probably never been there may have never been any other time in recent world history where there seemed to be so little genuine interest in the fundamentals of persuasive rhetoric. More and more now, the airwaves are filled with Howard Stern and Ann Coulter and Rush Limbaugh and Al Franken and John Kerry, and we could go on forever like this. People who don't even seem as if they're pretending to really try to reach anybody who doesn't already agree with them. All they want to do, and many of them largely for the sake of money, they want to keep their audiences inflamed, and they're doing nothing but doling out big chunks of red meat to the hungry wolves who already agree with just about everything they think. Well, that's okay. And to be sure, there's a valuable place occasionally played in world history by this kind of incendiary demagoguery. Some of the worst things that have ever been done in the history of the world, well, Hitler, for the classic example, have been done through the effective use of demagogic and incendiary rhetoric. But then again, by the same token, there have been times, important times in world history, justly celebrated moments, when the good guys, pick the general of your choice, General Patton, maybe, Eisenhower, got up before the troops, and he gave them a speech that made them want to get out there and do something. or some professor got up there and gave a speech that animated and excited a group of would-be Christian leaders to get out there and change the world, just like it says over the portals. But you know what? That's not the most difficult form of rhetoric. When you preach into the choir and you're trying to just get them worked up like a preacher talking to the choir or like a coach talking to his own team, it's not that difficult to engage in stride and hyperbole like Ann Coulter and Rush Limbaugh. You just pile on the adjectives and the accusations and the name-calling and the smearing and it comes natural, I dare say, for all of us to one degree or another. I want to focus on a more difficult form of public speaking, and I'll call it, again, persuasive rhetoric. Suppose you're talking to an audience that doesn't already agree with you. Or more likely, there's a mixture in the audience. Some are pro-life, some are pro-choice, some are conservative, Republican, Democrat, liberal. But your honest hope is not to shame people, or not to rally your troop. Your honest conviction, praise God, is that you're actually going to find some words and a way of speaking them that actually might gently nudge a couple hearts, a couple minds, a few souls in the direction of what you believe and hope they may believe before you're done. What are some of the things that you can do to maximize your prospects for pulling it off? First, you need to establish rapport. Rapport with your audience, of course. There's a lot that could be said on this particular subject, but I won't, because most of what could be said on this particular subject would be stating the obvious. You've been around as long as I have, most of you, some longer. You know as well as I do the fundamentals of what it means to make a good first impression on folks. Think about that. Reflect on it. Think about the things that you've seen other people do in your experience that caused them to rub you the wrong way or the right way the first time they met you. And those are the kinds of things you want to make sure you make a concerted effort to do in every public appearance, including, of course, speaking appearances. Your guess is just as good as mine. I would hazard the guess that three of the most essential ingredients in a good public appearance on the part of a public speaker or anyone else trying to make a good first impression are honesty and sincerity, knowledge, and some measure of objectivity and humility. And they're listed here in no special order, although I suppose honesty and sincerity may be the most important. You don't want to allow yourself, and I teach in the law school. How many, by the way, let me see, how many of you are law students? How many of you are not law students? Good, a nice mix. In the law school, of course, we've got, like all of you, we're training for different kinds of public speaking and writing assignments. I train trial lawyers, and trial lawyers labor under special disability because the public sees you walk into the courtroom, and the first thing they know about you, even before they know your name, is that you're a lying snake. Or at least that's what they're likely to assume or to suspect. Remember what I said earlier about know your audience, know their assumptions, and be ready to realistically reckon with those assumptions. It's incumbent upon any of you, especially those of us like lawyers who generally labor under a disability of imperfect public appearance, that we strive mightily to convey to our audience as quickly as we can, I really mean this. I really believe this. This really is true, or I wouldn't say it to you. How do you do that? Well, you avoid telling lies, of course. You avoid exaggeration as far as possible. Avoid hyperbole, over-the-top comparisons. My opponent sounds just like Adolf Hitler. I mean, then you come across as not being terribly objective, right? And knowledge is something within limits that you want to be able to convey to the audience. You don't want them to think you know nothing about which you speak. But then again, you don't want to overdo this knowledge angle. It doesn't do you much good. I mean, to walk into an audience and say, well, let me tell you how great I am, how knowledgeable, how understanding and brilliant I am, how many years I've done this and how many years I've done that. It doesn't get you anywhere. Take it from me. I've tried it. I've learned the hard way. It doesn't impress your students. It doesn't help you pick up girls at the church social. In fact, what you noticed when I came in here, instead of trotting out the fact that I was Phi Beta Kappa at Harvard College, which I was, first thing I suppose I said to you, not that I had planned to, but the first thing I said to you was the fact, and it was true, that I've not ever had any formal classical training in the fundamentals of rhetoric. And in that particular moment, don't you suppose, you tell me if I'm wrong, didn't you feel just this little tiny bit closer to me? We began to develop a little bit of a rapport. There's something you and I have in common. Neither one of us studied classical rhetorical theory at Yale, going back to the original, reading Aristotle in Greek. For what? You know, when I spoke earlier about knowing your audience, an example that came to mind, I've sat through in my day more than my fair share of talks about rhetoric. Many of them delivered by esteemed professors, highly trained in the venerable art of rhetorical theory. And I tell you, I can't tell you how tedious most of them were. Because most folks who are highly trained in the art of rhetoric, they invariably get up and they start trotting out all these Greek words written by Aristotle. Justifiably, they think, because after all, he was the father of modern rhetorical theory, and he talked all about logos and ethos and pathos and helios. I don't even know what these words mean. Why should you care? I know you don't know these words. What's the point of getting up in front of an audience and trotting out a bunch of words that mean nothing to them, and they write them down in the Greek, and then you have to go about translating them back into English? Cut out the middleman. The guy's dead. God bless Aristotle, but there's no particular point served in teaching you a few Greek terms just so that we can translate them back into English again. And you divinity students, you future pastors, I'm here to tell you, preachers don't score points with their audience when they get up there in what looks like a seeming effort to flaunt their acumen and training by every sermon. Let me tell you, the original Greek, if you go to the original Greek, you see that it uses the word entafiazo. And entafiazo, if you trace it back to English, means to bury. Oh, okay, great. Well, then why don't you just use the word bury? In fact, that's what it says in my Bible right here in English. You don't do anything to impress or to help or to educate or to inspire your audience by sharing with them the useless knowledge that the English text that's sitting right in front of them can be translated back into Greek, over to Japanese, back into Spanish, back into English, and it means the same thing. I've heard this so many times in my life from the pulpit. There are times, of course. There are occasions. They are rare. When you can actually teach your audience something important, instructive, maybe even entertaining, about the unlikely and improbable fact that in Yugoslavian, there is a word that cannot be fully translated perfectly into English. It captures a concept that no English word can adequately convey. I'm making this up, by the way, but I'm getting your hopes up, am I not? You were hoping I was about to tell you about this Yugoslavian word. This was actually starting to work up a little bit of intrigue in you, because that's something worth telling us. Otherwise, forget about it. Now, as far as establishing rapport goes, the next item to obviously deal with is the whole subject of talking about yourself. Remember, I said, your guess, good as mine, but in my limited experience, really one of the most fundamental ingredients in any context, these days especially, in trying to break across the divide and actually reach the hearts and minds of folks you don't know, is to try to come across as humble, down to earth, an ordinary kind of a guy. No coat and tie, unless I really need to. And in that vein, there are some do's and don'ts about how to talk about yourself. You want to build empathy, of course, by identifying your common ground with the audience. First thing, don't put this off. Sooner the better. If there's something that you and your audience have in common, things that you've all done, things that none of you have done, especially things that would seem unlikely, things they wouldn't naturally guess. I'll tell you something about myself. I applied to Yale College when I was a high school student, and they rejected me. And then when I was a college student, I applied to Yale Law School, and they rejected me again. Twice I got dissed by Yale. Anybody else here get rejected by Yale twice? Couldn't get into Yale? I'm the only one? How embarrassing. Well, okay, forget it. A bad example. But you get my point. If there are things that you can do in the way that you dress, the way that you stand. Even look where I'm standing now. I could stand back there behind the lectern, of course, and allow that barrier to create a kind of a psychological distance between us. But just by standing a little bit close, not too close to all of you, again, it's part of my effort to sort of establish a sort of rapport, a seeming rapport, to help you reminisce, perhaps with fondness, those halcyon days when you sat around the fireplace with Mom and Dad. Dad sitting up there with his turtleneck and his microphone. I don't know. I could dream, can I? You get the karaoke, right? Good example. Try as far as possible to when you're speaking to your audience, try to avoid the natural habit of referring to them as you. You need to do this, and you need to do this, with the finger pointing, by the way, at the same time. Much more effective is we need to do this. A few years ago, before any of you were law students, I heard once a law student give a great devotional message at the beginning of class. It really was one of the best ones I've ever heard. But he put his audience on ice. He didn't know it. I explained to him afterwards. It was virtually a flawless presentation of an excellent biblical message. But he kept talking to them about you. What you need to do. You all need, when someone comes, his message basically was when people come up to you and they say, hey, brother, I've got a message for the Lord from you, and they say things that are likely to convict you or to challenge you, don't resist it. It might be the Lord talking to you, and you need to listen to them, and you need to realize that God might be trying to get you. You get the idea. Everybody was put off on their guard, and a bit of a distance was unnecessarily created. If he had given that exact same little sermonette, just saying, here's what we need to do. We need to do this, would have created a very different atmosphere altogether. Now, gentle and sincere self-deprecation, it appears, in moderation, I think can work wonders. If it's gentle and if it's sincere. Like I said, that's what I was doing a moment ago when I came in here. I had not planned this, but just sort of instinctively doing what I've been doing for years as a public speaker. First thing I wanted to do was to tell you something to kind of, I don't know. So I wanted to tell you something about myself to minimize the perceived distance between us. After he got up here and said those nice things about me, I wanted to remind you I'm not so different as you might think. Don't get your hopes up. I haven't been formally trained in classical theory, but my next word was. I then went on. The but is crucial. I didn't emphasize the word but effectively employed, gentle and sincere self-deprecation is always followed with the word but. You all know that old song, don't know much about biology, don't know much trigonometry, don't know much about no rise and fall, don't know much about nothing at all. So I don't know why you'd want to go out with a louse like me. No, that's not the next line. The next line is, but I do know that I love you, and I knew that if you loved me too, what a wonderful world it would be. And so it is throughout the history of the world. If you listen closely and watch closely, great speakers and writers, frequently, even the most gifted of them, frequently employ this form of gentle self-deprecation. Abraham Lincoln, in the Gettysburg Address, one of the most highly regarded and widely renowned speeches in American history, he throws in this line near the end, the world will little note, nor long remember, he says, the words that I speak here today. And ironically, it's part of the majesty of the piece, and part of the reason that we do know this crazy little speech that he gave, because he came across as sort of a down-to-earth, common sort of a man. It's got to be done, of course, in moderation. You can't overdo this. Like any other rhetorical trick, if you try this every single sentence, I'm such a lousy professor, I don't know. It won't do you much good. Quickly, this act wears real thin and real quick. And most fundamental of all, it's got to be sincere. Otherwise, people will go running out halfway through the talk if they sense that you're full of baloney. God bless. No, seriously. It's got to be sincere. It's got to at least appear sincere. As George Burns was reputed to have once said, nothing moves an audience like sincerity. And when you learn how to fake that, you got it made. I'm not preaching a message of fake sincerity. I don't think you can fake such a thing successfully. But if the folks who are listening to you perceive that all this self-deprecation is all tongue-in-cheek, oh, I'm not that wonderful, oh, I'm not that special, you know what I'm talking about. You've heard people do this. That has a counterproductive effect altogether on the audience. It won't do you any good. So if you don't really mean it, if there's something about yourself, I come from humble beginnings. I was born in a log cabin on the rural outskirts of southeastern Manhattan. If it's true, by all means, throw it in there. Or lines like these, with good reason, are well-worn staples of rhetorical jargon. Lines such as, now, I'm no rocket scientist. What's the next word? But. Well, I may not be a lawyer, but. Well, I didn't go to Harvard like my opponent, but. Again, the but is crucial because, the point is not you shouldn't be listening to me. The point is I don't have some of these things, some of these trappings of worldly erudition that my opponent over there might have, but I do know that I love you, or whatever the next line is of the song or the speech that you're giving. You see what I mean? One of my pet peeves, here's another example. One of my pet peeves, and you've all seen this, haven't you? You see this all the time. Somebody gets up, a public speaker gets up in front of an audience, like I did here tonight. Somebody gets up to introduce them, as Mr. Ladd did. They get up and it's quite obvious to everybody who's watching that the introducing gentleman is reading all of this stuff. You can see he's reading it. You can tell he's not speaking from memory. You can see that he's going to, from 1955 to 1957, he has served in the office of General Counsel for the Regent administration, blah, blah. And after he reads through this long thing that everybody in the room knows was handed to him by the speaker or by the speaker's secretary, the speaker then gets up and says, oh, thank you for that very generous introduction. That was too kind. And everyone's sitting there, what do you mean too kind? We all know what's happening here. He read something you gave him. Don't pretend like you don't want to hear this thing read in public. If you give it to him, don't act like you're ashamed of it. If you don't want it being read in public, don't pretend you're embarrassed by it. Don't give it to them. See? Self-deprecation doesn't work unless it seems to be sincere. Otherwise, it backfires. But there is one form of gentle self-deprecation that I advise you, in my humble opinion, to totally avoid, and that is, you can talk about the limits of your education and your upbringing and your training and your schooling and your etiquette and your diction and your pronunciation, because the jury knows, or the audience knows, the church knows, the students know, that those things are not what's really important. And the great wisdom can come from the mouth of somebody who doesn't know a whole lot of those things. But never, never, never get up in front of an audience and start self-deprecating over your preparation, organization, or time management. You know what I'm talking about. How often you sit there and you listen to some professor, or some speaker, or some lawyer going on and on, constantly interrupting themselves. Oh, my gosh, look at, oh, I'm running out of time. I better speed up. I'm losing my, oh, is it? Oh, yeah, I got to go. I've got a lot of slides to cover. I better go a little faster. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit here. What are they doing? Why are you saying this? These people remind me of long-distance runners who keep stopping, running in the middle of a race. They go to the side. They get on the cell phone. Coach, I'm falling behind. What do I do? How about you throw the phone and get back to work, okay? There's nothing to be gained by wasting even a few precious seconds complaining about the fact that, yikes, I guess I'm not very good at time management. I guess I didn't plan this very well. I've got a lot more to cover, and my time's running out faster than I thought it would. Can it? It's a natural feeling. It's a natural impulse. We'll all find ourselves from time to time in that very situation. I'll find myself in that situation in about 20 minutes, but you won't see it on my face. I won't show it. I won't acknowledge it. There's nothing to be gained. And the obvious downside is no audience responds favorably to such things because it's tantamount to saying to them, I'm lazy. I really didn't prepare as thoroughly as I should have. I guess if I had planned this a little bit better, I wouldn't be so far behind right now. I guess if I kept an eye on the clock out of respect for you, I wouldn't be where I am right now in the outline. Maybe these things are true, but please, what have you got to gain by advertising them? People take this as an insult. You get the idea. You get the idea. We'll move on. Any questions, comments, thoughts, reactions, suggestions, complaints? Okay. Number 4. If you are serious about the gentle art of persuasive communication, you've got to act gracious, and you've got to act open-minded. Remember what I said before about rapport with the listeners, with the audience? You want to appear to be objective. You don't want to come across like some totalitarian demagogue speaking with rock-like certitude, like all those other hardheads on the religious right. You want to come across, right or left, it doesn't matter, as being someone open-minded. Because you won't convince anybody of anything if you're right like Ann Coulter, not that she's trying to. You want to make your audience think that you're a sensible and a sober young man or woman, or old, either way, who actually came to her considered convictions on this particular subject after a long and searing soul-searching journey, carefully exploring the theoretical and the ethical and the scientific and pragmatic implications of the arguments on both sides. How do you go about doing that? Well, here's a few particular bits of advice. Number 1, you've got to be a good listener. You know, I've been at the law school now, praise God, for almost 16 years. And in all those years, I've served on the admissions committee for years, sometimes. And we read these applications for admission. I read some of yours. And in all these years, I've seen probably more than 100 applications for admission written by law students, would-be law students, who are asked on the application, why do you want to go to law school? Why do you feel called to be a lawyer? And one of the most common answers, top 5, is, oh, I've always been a great talker. Ever since I was 3 years old, my Aunt Wilma said, you should go to law school. I was 3 years old. They said, you're such a talker, you should go to law school. That's part of the problem with this profession, that somehow the public has gotten the idea that we're chock full of good talkers. What this profession desperately needs is more good listeners. And I haven't got time to elaborate a great deal right now, but what this world needs is more good listeners. And you want to be a good speaker. If you're put in a setting such as in a debate or a dialogue or a trial where you are given an opportunity to speak perhaps after somebody else has already spoken, have it help you if you get up there and read your speech, something you wrote before your opponent even began to speak. Or more likely, you get up and you give what is essentially what you had already planned to say anyway, acting it for all the world as if you hadn't heard a word of what your opponent had just said. Listen to what your opponent says. Listen closely. It's vital that you listen closely to what they say so you can do the rest of what's on this slide. And it's also vital because it'll go miles toward quickly establishing you in the minds of your listeners as a reasonable kind of a person. Not some dogmatic ideologue or iconoclast who cares nothing for what anybody else has to say but me. So be a good listener and make it obvious to your audience from the things that you say that I was paying attention to what he said and or she made some very good points. Give your opponents and their views ample credit and praise, as Ann Coulter would do, right? Oh, yeah, as if. I'm joking. As long as you could do so without seeming insincere, sincerity is rule number 1. Aristotle called that ethos, by the way, for those of you who love Greek. Anybody here from the divinity school? You've got to come there. God bless. Thanks for coming. I'm in town till Tuesday. Aristotle, forget Aristotle. what I said earlier, you've got to come across as seeming sincere. And so everything else I say here can only be effectively employed if you can do it without seeming as if you're acting about it. So don't get up and start larding on all this false praise that you really don't mean. And be careful with things such as, well, I'm not as smart and sophisticated as my opponent over there. I don't have all the training and expertise that he does. I mean, don't say that, unless it's obvious from the way you talk and the accent that you use that you really aren't all as sophisticated as he is. But most definitely don't get up there at the beginning of your opening statement in front of the jury and say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I trust and pray that you shall not hold it against me or my client that I'm not possessed with the sophisticated acumen and linguistic aptitude with which my opponent has been so obviously blessed. That's obviously a lie. Don't talk that way if it isn't true. Avoid name calling. Of course. Avoid hyperbole. Use hyperbole with caution. If you're trying to be persuasive, you generally don't score any points by engaging in gratuitous analogies to certain kinds of inflammatory topics. And we could list them pretty easily enough. The Holocaust, Adolf Hitler, slavery, abortion, the Genghis Khan, John Kerry. I mean, there are certain figures, certain movements. God bless John Kerry. Certain figures, certain movements, certain ideas in the history of the world that are so volatile and inflammatory that just even a casual comparison to them can easily offend your listeners and cause many of them to regard you as an extremist. Several years ago, I'll give you an example, a good example. Several years ago, a prominent and outspoken leader in the pro-life community came to Regent at the invitation of the Regent Students for Life. And he spoke on campus probably before any of you got here. It would have been. And he came in and he gave a talk at chapel and another talk for students who wanted to listen. And the essence of his talk, which I enjoyed, it was a sophisticated and a historically informed comparison of abortion and slavery. And he talked about a number of very interesting and not so well-known parallels between the legal protection that we give to abortion and the arguments that we give to abortion, and a lot of the legal and historical arguments that were being trotted out more than 100 years ago here in America to justify the institution of slavery. And being an ardent pro-lifer, his rhetoric made it plain enough, too, that he thought that the vile atrocity of abortion was every bit as bad as anything that was ever done to anybody during the slavery chapter in American history. Well, it turns out that a large number of students were put off a great deal. And I mean, to be blunt, black students, by and large, black students, many of them, were put off a great deal by this particular fellow's comparison. Just as, no offense to blacks, of course, just as Jewish listeners would naturally be put off by any speaker who gets up and says, you know what, the thing I'm here to talk to you about is as bad as what Hitler did to the Jews and the Holocaust. It is a modern-day Holocaust. There are many people who, obviously with no disrespect and no offense and no fault of theirs, all of us, not many people, all of us, one way or another, because of our personal experience, because of our genetic makeup, because of our race, because of our heritage, we have natural feelings, deep feelings about living with an alcoholic father, or being the victim of a drunk driver, or being the victim of child abuse, or slavery, or the Holocaust. You get the idea. So tread with great caution when touching casually upon analogies to you that seem to make perfect sense, knowing full well that to some audience members, nothing can compare with the terrible tragedy of slavery or the Holocaust or being abused by your stepfather. That's the way it is. And these comparisons are usually gratuitous. These kinds of hyperbolic comparisons aren't usually necessary. There's usually a better, more effective way of making the comparison. And if it is your aim, as the speaker's aim was, to actually educate his audience about the fact that some of the arguments that we're now accepting about abortion were the same sorts of things that were being said in very similar language about slavery, to justify slavery, he should have done it in a very different way, as experience subsequently taught him and me. How could he have done it how could he have done it? Done the same thing, much more effectively. Any ideas, any guesses? Yes? Speak up. A disclaimer. Excellent. Well, what sort of a disclaimer do you mean? Sure. Or better yet, you say to take care not to belittle or to lighten, let's say, the institution, the enormity, the horror of the American institution of slavery as we practiced in this country for so very long. Even better than not belittling it, what else could he have done to have maximize the effectiveness of his presentation, you think? Yes, sir.
I was going to say that to not give the knowledge just for the sake of giving the knowledge, but to apply it in some way. So to say, here's the similarities, and here's how those arguments were defeated 100 years ago. So that's what we can do today. I think that would tend to sort of...
That's good. That's excellent. Not exactly the answer to my last question, but I'm glad you shared that honestly. Yes?
Start out by expressing all the gravity of the horrors of the American slavery, institutionalized
Absolutely.
slavery, and just getting to just how awful that is.
Absolutely. I don't guarantee that would have made his talk a resounding success. No way to know. But there's no question his talk would have been much more effective if he had begun, instead of just taking it as a given, well, we all know slavery was terrible. Now let's talk about abortion. Now let me show you how it's just like slavery. He would have had nothing to lose and everything to gain if he'd actually begun and devoted at least a full 5 minutes to making it perfectly plain that I yield to nobody in my horror, in my shame and revulsion at the outrage that was perpetrated in the name of slavery here in America. And let me tell you, let me remind you of how horrible it was. And then to launch into an eloquent and sincere explanation of why this was, in the scale of human history, one of the most, if not the most outrageous thing that was ever done to humanity by humanity. And then, of course, obviously, he would not have put his audience quite so, certain members of it at least, so ill at ease when he then began to say, and by the way, there are some comparisons. And even then, when he did go into the comparisons, there was no need for him to say, or to try to persuade anybody. And let me tell you something, abortion, just as bad as slavery. No question, he didn't need to go that far. All he had to do was to say there are some parallels that we just simply can't ignore. There are some, I mean, I'm not to say that abortion and what we're doing in the area of abortion is as bad as what we did in the area of slavery. But surely, you've got to admit that there are certain respects in which the two things were, horrible for some of the same reasons. I mean, would have been a very different introduction to the same talk. That's what I mean when I say avoid hyperbole. When I say avoid stereotyping, and this one, like all these other rhetorical tricks, works great at home over the breakfast table. It ordinarily does you absolutely no good when you're addressing somebody in an effort to engage in persuasive communication to say, you know, that's just like a blank. You sound just like a blank. You know, you name it. That's just like a man. You sound just like a Republican. You sound just like a black man. You sound just like a Democrat. That's just like what I would expect from a Filipino. This is outrageous. These are outrageous things generally to think, and even if there's some measure of truth to them, from time to time there might be. You gain nothing by saying such a thing. All of us resent being stereotyped, even if it's being done in a gentle way, even if it's being done seemingly for a benign purpose. You know, even when you're not criticizing your opponent, you're saying, "Oh, that was clever. That was witty. That was just like an Irishman." You know, people don't generally appreciate that sort of thing. Talk to them as a person and talk to them about their positions. And I listened to you. I heard what you had to say, and you might want to go from time to time into an explanation of. Now, that's interesting. You would say that. I'll show you a good example of this in a moment. One more thing. Be like Abraham Lincoln was reputed to have been. Here's a well-known textbook. It's called Trying Cases to Win. It's written by Herbert Stern, a former federal prosecutor and a former federal judge. He talks about how to be an effective trial attorney. Chapter 1, he calls it personal advocacy. He's talking about all the things that I'm discussing. I'd like to read to you in here. There's a quote here from this book. It says, "There are no verbatim trial records of Abraham Lincoln as a lawyer. Although shorthand existed at the time, no shorthand reporters were in the courts in which he appeared. But he was described to us by his law partner of many years, Billy Herndon, and by one of the men against whom he often tried cases." And here's a quote from what one of Lincoln's contemporaries wrote about this man, who, by the way, in his day was widely regarded as an extraordinarily successful and effective trial attorney. Quote, "As he entered the trial," relates one of his colleagues at the bar, "where most lawyers would object, he would say he reckoned it would be fair to let this in or that in. And when his adversaries could not quite prove what Lincoln knew to be the truth, he'd say, well, I reckon it'd be fair to admit the truth to be so-and-so. When Lincoln did object to the court, and when he heard his objections overruled, he would often say, well, I reckon I must be wrong. Now, about the time he had practiced this 3/4 of the way through the case, if his adversary didn't understand him, his adversaries would often wake up at learning they had feared the Greeks too late and found themselves beaten. He was wise as a serpent in the trial of a cause. But I have had too many scars from his blows to certify that he was harmless as a dove. When the whole thing was unraveled, the adversary would begin to see that what he was so blandly giving away, that's Lincoln, was simply what he could not get and keep. By giving away 6 points and carrying the 7th, he carried his case. And the whole case was hanging on the 7th. He traded away everything which would give him the least aid in carrying that. Any man who took Lincoln for a simple-minded man would very soon wake up with his back in a ditch. Well, this is the idea. You get the point. Lincoln was, at least legend has it, highly successful with audiences and juries in particular because of his seeming willingness to get up there on a regular basis and say, well, I guess I reckon that's probably true too, and I reckon that's okay, and I reckon it wouldn't hurt to let that evidence in, and I reckon you're right about that judge too. What's he doing when he's doing all this sort of thing? He's doing all the things that we've been talking about. He's giving away the things he can't keep. He's making concessions left and right. He's trying to establish himself as being objective and reasonable and fair-minded and sober, sort of like a judge you would expect. And he's also engaging in a very gentle form of self-deprecation. Well, I suppose that might be true. He's not saying, Your Honor, I know this and I know that. He's saying, well, I suppose that's so, and I don't know, but maybe. He's conducting himself like a common man. Concede as much as you possibly can, and do so before you start to disagree. When you get up to speak after another lawyer, or another debater, or another speaker, you will disarm your opponents, and you will surprise your audience every time if you begin in an act of seeming graciousness by saying, my opponent has made some very important points, and almost everything she says is true. I mean, people don't expect to hear this in a debate. But the next words that come out of your mouth are almost sure to be received with a little bit more seriousness than they otherwise would have enjoyed, because the audience is saying, my gosh, what kind of a man is this? He gets up here and admits that almost everything she said was true. If, when all is said and done, you really can't deny most of what they say, or you can't disprove it, or even if you could, it isn't worth fighting over, get up there first and make it plain where you agree with your opponent, how you admire your opponent, and compliment them as far as you can reasonably do so without compromising your case or sacrificing your seeming sincerity. Let's look at a great example of this. Garrison Keillor, you all know this fella. He's the host of a radio show called Prairie Home Companion. And in my book, he's one of the greatest living rhetoricians. Well, I don't know how to say it. I never studied this stuff myself. But he's good at this stuff, is what I'm trying to say. He is a master of rhetoric. If you listen to this guy, it'll do you well. And he's got a website. It's prairiehomecompanion.something or other. You can find it through google.com, I'm sure. And I just looked at his website the other day, and he's got a letter there that was written by an angry listener, a Catholic, as it turns out. And Garrison Keillor, from time to time, I don't listen to him often enough, but I guess he's apparently made a custom, some of his listeners think, of engaging in anti-Catholic diatribe. And this one listener wrote a very eloquent letter. I read the letter. It's on the webpage. You can look it up. And the letter is very penetrating, and it is provocative, and it is lucid, and is well written. And by the time you're done reading this letter, you got yourself thinking, wow, look at these examples. Look at this evidence. Boom, boom, boom. This Garrison Keillor really is some sort of an anti-Catholic bigot. Well, Garrison Keillor proudly puts the letter right up there on the webpage, which says something to begin with. And then he writes a lengthy response. And here's the beginning of his response. And I think this is great stuff. Look at it with me and analyze it with me. What's good about this, or not so good, and why? Here's how he begins. He says, Dear CF, that was the guy's initials, yours is just about the best angry letter I've received in more than 30 years of doing the show, and I admire it. Now, you think the guy who wrote the letters is expected to see a response like this? I mean, he doesn't say yours is one of the best letters I've ever seen. Oh, no. And by the time you're done, you know full well Garrison doesn't think anything like that. But he says it's one of the best angry letters I've ever seen. And I admire it. It maintains a high level of rage and contempt throughout. I mean, he's gently alluding to the fact that there's a problem with this letter, but he's doing it in a kind of a congratulatory way. And you've got some of your facts straight. Notice the word some. I mean, again, Garrison goes on to explain that most of your facts are wrong. But before zeroing in on that, he wants to seem gracious, open-minded, objective, fair. So he's quick to volunteer. You got some of your facts right. You're absolutely right about my Pope Clement. I guess when he was on the air, he referred to the current Pope as Pope Clement. I guess his name is Benedict. I should know this. It's not Clement. I know that. And when the guy writes, and you idiot, Pope Clement's been dead for 100 years, 500 years. He says, you're right. You're absolutely right about my Pope Clement slip, one of those truly dumb moments that one recognizes about 15 seconds too late to do anything about. See how he's sort of trying to diminish that? So you're right about that. You got me on that one. Although he's saying in the next breath, it was something I knew myself. 15 seconds after I spoke it, I knew it myself. And it's very well written, but you don't know how to stop once you get started. Anger can do this to a person. You get in and you forget where the brakes are. And then he slowly slides into a point-by-point rebuttal of the other assorted mistakes that were made by this other guy. What do you think about this? I mean, if you had been the one who had written, if you had been CF from Seattle, Washington, who had written this letter complaining to Garrison Keillor, and you had received this response through the mail, or as it turns out, on the website, what would be your reaction to the fact that he begins this way? Would you be further infuriated at the man than you were already? Pleasantly surprised? Well, what? Well, how would it affect you, and why, and how? Yes, sir. It's plausible. That's a predictable reaction. It's not unlikely some people will read this and think that of Mr. Keillor, that he's going a little too far too close to the line of genuine sarcasm, and that may be true. But let's put it this way: in Mr. Keillor's defense, I mean, you haven't read the rest of the exchange. In the rest of his letter, Mr. Keillor made no secret of the fact that he thought his opponent was nuts. And but he wanted to, and that his comments were overblown and too extreme, and not supported by the evidence. And he wanted to gently move himself in that direction. Notice one line in particular here that I think is especially ingenious. Look at the last three lines. He says, He says your letter is very well written, quick to concede the good stuff, and there's no reason to doubt that he means what he says when he says your letter. It seems to be well written. It was obviously well written. I mean, after all, he put it on the webpage. And the next line he says, but you don't know how to stop once you get started. Look at this next line. Anger can do this to a person. What's it particularly ingenious about that choice of words? Anyone? The use of the third person. You notice he does what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, I can tell you're a very angry man. You Catholics are very often like that. Or you people who have problems with your anger, you often end up being, talking in a condescending tone, as if I know better and I understand better the problems that are routinely suffered by people like you, people who have problems with anger, or whatever the case may be, you Irishmen, you Catholics, or whatever it is. No, quite the contrary. He says, anger can do this to a person in the third person, since his obvious purpose in this paragraph is to some extent to mollify or placate his listener, his critic. What's especially nice to be noted about the choice of the image that he uses here? He doesn't say, I perceive you like the man who's in the grip of a profound madness. He doesn't say that. I think you're angry. Because of your anger, I think you're out of your mind. He doesn't analogize his critic's problem to mental illness. He doesn't analogize it to stupidity. What does he analogize it to? A car with problems with the brakes, which is a very gentle way of saying, you got a problem that I can understand. I've been there too, and I know what it's like. And no offense intended. It's sort of like being in a car when you can't quite get the brakes, as if to say, it's not you, it's the car. Again, I'm not saying this is the best that could be done, but I think most of us would agree. I don't mind telling you, my sense is that if I had been Mr. Garrison Keillor's critic, I would have been taken aback at the gentility of these concessions and at the graciousness of his concession. That my problem, as he sees it, is nothing worse than what he's been through himself in angry moments when you can't quite seem to find where to put your foot, as if it's all the fault of this machine here and not me. Here is, is this the next slide? Thanks. Here is another example of the same thing. R.J. Reynolds, one of the leading manufacturers of tobacco products in America, they put this on their webpage. They've got a lot of stuff on the webpage because, of course, they've got a lot of splaining to do. And you want to learn a lot about rhetoric, one of the best places to go is to go to the web pages of the folks who sell tobacco or perform abortion or do something really outrageous and despicable that needs to be explained, because they'll find a way to spend their money getting the best rhetorical specialists they can to do their explaining for them. Look at how they speak about the subject of smokers' rights. This section of their website, they're trying to explain why it is that they're talking about this, what they perceive to be the looming problem with more and more communities rising up, passing these anti-smoking ordinances. Well, if you were being paid by R.J. Reynolds to try to talk about that subject, what would you say? How would you begin? What would you write first? I think most of us would begin with a line like this. Here in America, our founding fathers were dedicated from the beginning to the proposition that the freedom of every man, blah, 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 blah. They don't start that way. They know better. They try to set their audience at ease with a surprising concession. Listen how they begin. Adults who choose to smoke make a personal decision that carries with it certain responsibilities and rights. Now, before you're done reading the whole thing, and this is just an excerpt, before you read the whole thing, it's obvious enough that what they're really interested in talking to you about is smokers' rights. I mean, look at the title, Smokers' Rights. But they surprise you by conceding away those points that their critics would be quick to complain about if they were together in the same room. And there they go. Responsibilities they list first. For example, smokers have a responsibility to be respectful and courteous in the manner and places where they smoke, particularly when children are present. And the responsibility to properly dispose of cigarette butts and empty cigarette packages. Now, what does this have to do with anything? The answer is nothing. These responsibilities are not in any way logically related to smokers' rights. There's an alliterative connection between responsibilities and rights, but there's no logical connection that says, well, just because we've got more responsibilities, therefore we have more rights. I mean, that's the tacit implication here. If we promise not to keep dumping all our ashtrays out on the street every time we stop at a red light, then you've got to let us blow our poisonous fumes in your face. I mean, they don't come right out and say it that way, but that's the tacit assumption of the way this nonsense is written. And then they go on in the rest of the passage to talk rather nicely and cleverly and gently and gingerly about why it's so important that we smokers, as American citizens, stand up for our right to smoke in public places. But they don't go there until first they begin by conceding a couple of irrelevant non sequiturs that their critics would be quick to agree with. You're right. We shouldn't be dumping stuff in the streets. Shouldn't be poisoning the environment. We should keep that to a minimum. What's the effect of this? What's the purpose? It's to take your audience by surprise and trying to instill in them the sense that the guy who's writing this is actually kind of balanced, sort of fair-minded about the whole thing, able to see both sides of this. It's not true. That's what they want you to think, of course. You can read the rest of it later and analyze it with your friends as an example of why do they write the rest of the stuff that when they do start talking about smoker rights, look at the words they use, how they do choose to describe it. There's some interesting lessons to be drawn from the words they use and what they didn't say, but we'll skip that in the interest of time. I'm running out of time. I've got to move along quickly. Number 5, almost done. One of the most important points, needless to say, is carefully choose the words that you will use. Carefully consider your choice of words. Use the words, of course, that will best convey your message, because, needless to say, the words that you choose will have a powerful impact on the audience. If you're describing a collision between cars, do you want to say to your audience that I saw the whole thing, they bumped into each other, or they smashed into each other, or they collided? These different verbs essentially mean the same thing denotatively, but obviously they carry a world of difference in the ears of your audience. How do you get good at this? How do you become a specialist in extemporaneous methods of elegant and eloquent expression? I don't know. I can't even do it myself. But it helps to go back to that website and listen to the great people do it all the time. Don't listen to so much television. It doesn't help. It's probably making things worse. And it's definitely making things worse if you are now saying, I'm like. Yeah, you knew this was coming. This is why I am so hard on my students about this diabolical excrescence that you youngsters under the age of 40 are now going around spreading like some sort of toxic linguistic abuse. I'm like, and she's like, and I'm like, and she's like. This is intolerable. It is the antithesis of intelligent communication because it never successfully conveys to your audience what you meant to say. If I'm like simply meant I said, I could live with it. But through years of listening to my students, I have learned that when a student says, I'm like, it could actually mean one of 100 different things. It could mean I said, I asked, I warned her, I remonstrated with her, I reminded her, I patiently explained, she rudely interrupted, I slowly cautioned her, she began to chant, I slowly came to understand. That's how people of my generation would try to describe an exchange, and you would get a real feel for who was the good guy and who was the bad guy. Now, you listen to anybody under the age of 40 talk about their exchange with the state trooper. Well, I was like, then he's like, then I'm like, then he's like, then I'm like, then he's like. My friends, I'm here to tell you there is no conceivable context in which that is the most colorful and precise and persuasive way of trying to explain what you mean. Never. For maximum emotional and persuasive impact, give careful consideration to the length of the words that you use. This, in my opinion, is one of the most fundamental principles of rhetoric. Short words and short sentences, perhaps just simply because of the way that we are wired, have maximum emotional and persuasive impact. By the way, this, I believe, is being audiotaped. Videotaped, it turns out. For those of you who are listening to this on tape, or have been blessed with uncommonly good memories, think back or rewind and listen to what I said when we began. When I began by talking about abortion from two different perspectives, I hadn't exactly planned this, but I hadn't planned it at all. I mean, I hadn't written it out in advance. But if you listen closely to what I did, and I knew I was conscious of the fact that I was doing this, when I was trying to articulate, as best I could, a persuasive and tolerable version of the pro-choice message, knowing that I was addressing probably a largely pro-life group, I instinctively slipped into lots of long words and lots of long sentences. There were lots of 3, 4, and 5-syllable words. Remember all that stuff I said about our nation's unbridled and uncompromising constitutional commitment to a woman's right of procreative privacy. There's something about long words that, like a lullaby, lull you into kind of a sedative sedation. They don't provoke you. They don't wake you up. They don't rouse you into action. Short words do. Think about this for a minute. Think of some of the greatest speeches that you've ever heard given by your famous speakers, most favorite speakers of all time. Anybody? Give me an example. Can you quote for me a favorite line from some speech by Martin Luther King, perhaps?
I have a dream.
I have a dream. Look at that. Did I ask you to say that? No, I didn't. Has he said other things in his day that were equally inspiring and wonderful? And yes, of course, and so much more. But what do we remember? I have a dream. How about John F. Kennedy? What's his most famous line with which he is so well associated? Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Every word in that sentence, except country, is one word long. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. One syllable is what I meant to say. You'll pardon me. I didn't go to Yale, and I'm up past my bedtime. It's no surprise. It's no coincidence that the most powerful, evocative messages and moments from the greatest speeches of all, Ronald Reagan. You all remember what he said at the Berlin Wall? Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, tear down that wall, all one syllable. I mean, if John Kerry had been there, he would have said, Mr. Gorbachev, I challenge you to work with me toward the promulgation and gradual identification of a working protocol through which the gradual demolition, if not partial disembarkation of the structure might be meaningfully contemplated, blah, 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 blah. And who would remember it today? I shouldn't be picking on John Kerry. He's one of the worst examples of this particular abuse, but he's far from the only one. Far too many people today, the victims of higher education, think they can't communicate something effectively unless their sentences and words are generally way too long. What about long words? But conversely, as I was saying a moment ago, when I was trying to pitch to this pro-life community a rousing version of a pro-life message, did you notice? You probably didn't consciously notice, but I started slipping into lots of one-syllable words. The baby is grabbed by the leg and yanked out. He does not want to see her face, and he jams a fork in the back of her head. Every one of those words was one syllable long. Don't know why it's true, but it's a fact of life. There's something about these words that we've known since we were 4 years old that sends shivers up and down our spine. There's literally a visceral impact in short words. Long words won't do it. Not even Laurence Olivier could rouse a crowd to their feet with some sort of speech chock full of 4-syllable words. It cannot be done. Remember your coach at halftime trying to get you guys back in the game from 7 points down. Did he use a lot of 2-syllable words? I don't think he probably did. And long words, conversely, have the opposite effect. If I were speaking to a pro-choice group, let's say, if I were giving a pitch, I knew how I could move you one way or another, but if I had been speaking at some very liberal law school, let's say, and I were talking to the Women's Student Association at NYU, and I wanted to get up there and I wanted to give them what they would regard as a thoughtful, eloquent, decisive disquisition of the pro-choice position, I wouldn't have engaged in all that mumbo-jumbo about, our nation's long and unbridled commitment of constitutional freedom. I would have said, it's my body, it's my choice, it's my life, and they would have been cheering for me. That's the way it works, you see. Short words, as long as they are being pitched to somebody with whom you already have some modicum of agreement, have a way of getting people up on their feet, getting people worked up, getting people to say, that's right, amen. Long words have the opposite effect. They calm and sedate the audience. And technical and foreign words, forget about it. There's no good reason for that. I'll give you examples. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. R.J. Reynolds, not to pick on these folks, but why not? They put it up there on their website. This is, again, from their website. They've got a lot of things that they explain on their webpage, and I noticed this when I was looking at it today. They've got a section they call Core Values, where they try to explain in a positive way what they stand for and what they're all about. And look how it's written. Employees at every level across this company have had a chance to meet and talk. Look at that. Had a chance to meet and talk. All one syllable. And talk about the company's core values. At R.J. Reynolds, we are principled. We do the right thing. We treat every person with respect, fairness and integrity, and we embrace diversity. We encourage new ideas to build our business, reward innovative thinking and new, savvy ways of doing things. We translate ideas into action with boldness and speed. We believe in our values and we strive to win. Lots and lots of simple little one-syllable words. We strive to win. We do the right thing. Because they know, as students of rhetoric all understand, it's these short words that invariably, somehow or another, manage to have the greatest emotive impact. I mean, there's a highfalutin Harvard way of saying the same thing. They could have said, at R.J. Reynolds, we have consistently and assiduously labored to work toward the gradual identification and promulgation of a working interstitial interface for the modalities of... Huh? I mean, you could say this that way if you want, but they know what they're doing when they don't. And yet the same people on the same web page, when they're talking about what they call, when they're addressing something very different, they want to speak to the whole subject of the fact that this product that they're selling is killing more Americans than any other legal product in American history. When they're trying to address that particular subject, look at all the three-syllable words. They didn't have to, but they did. They say, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company believes that cigarette smokers are at significantly increased risk for a number of diseases and conditions, including lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, including heart disease, and chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis. Skip down a couple of sentences. R.J. Reynolds has been at the forefront in developing and applying methods to assess the relative toxicity of cigarette smoke. This work, along with our expertise in tobacco and smoke chemistry, has aided us in our long-standing and ongoing efforts to develop cigarettes that may have the potential to reduce the risks associated with smoking. Blah, 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 blah. See how they're talking? It's just the same way I was talking to you at the beginning of the talk, knowing that I was approaching a hostile audience and trying to get across a possible pro-choice message. I use the same kind of long sentences and long words that sort of set people, I don't know what it does and how it works, but it works like an opiate for the head. It sort of sedates you a little bit. It lulls you into a sort of a complacency. I mean, they could have come right out. Remember that other web page when they're talking about what's good about R.J. Reynolds? We strive to win. We do our best. Da, 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 da. There's a rhythm that goes back. It resonates deep inside our viscera to something special that moved us back when we were 4 years old on the playground. They could have used that sort of language here. They could have said, let's face the facts. Our stuff kills folks, and lots of them. Every day, Americans are choking to death, trying in vain to take one more breath, and it won't happen because for too many years, they've been giving too much of their money to our company. We've been getting rich at their expense, and they're dying by the thousands. That's what they're saying here. But they're careful to avoid the particular phraseology. So even though everybody understands exactly what this is all about, you see how long words and long sentences, by design, work in a different way on an audience than short words and short sentences. And this kills me. Remember I said earlier, long words, as long as they're long words that everybody understands and employs from time to time, can, under appropriate circumstances, have an appropriate rhetorical purpose. If you're trying to lull your audience into a kind of complacency or to settle them down or to calm them down and to make them understand tobacco, abortion, slavery, it's not as bad as it sounds. Let me explain. I mean, bad guys of every generation have become specialists in this kind of explaining. But technical jargon and lingo, which has become the bane of higher education in America today, has no place in effective functioning rhetorical discourse. This is from the pen of a real law professor. And I didn't go looking for this, by the way. I could have found worse examples. This was sent to me, believe it or not, in an email that I got this week. New York University Law School sends out, I don't know how they got my address. They send me these emails all the time, proudly boasting about these articles written by their law professors. I don't want to embarrass anybody by mentioning names. You can look it up on the internet if you want. But this was written by a tenured law professor at one of the finest law schools in America who was trying, it was called a precis or a synopsis of her article. It's sort of like a teaser, trying to get you enticed, intrigued enough to want to go read the rest of the article. And here's what she writes. You've got a copy of it in front of you. This is her description, heaven help her, of what's so special and intriguing about her article. She says, in recent years, the metaphor of dialogue has become increasingly ubiquitous within the constitutional theory, both in the United States and globally. It's a way of describing the nature of interactions between courts and non-judicial actors in the area of constitutional decision-making, particularly in relation to the interpretation of rights. Did you know that? Do you care? This article provides a critical account of theories of constitutional dialogue in order to determine which of these theories holds the greatest normative promise. Theories of dialogue face two hurdles to normative success. They must accomplish the goal of resolving the democratic objective to judicial review, and legitimacy aside, they must be able to provide an attractive normative vision of the role of judicial review in democratic constitutionalism. This article maintains that while theories of constitutional dialogue do make important contributions to our understanding of judicial review, most fail to provide satisfying normative visions of dialogue on these dual levels of analysis. This article concludes, hold your breath. I hate to spoil the big ending for you. I hate to ruin it in case you haven't read the article yet, but this article concludes that the greatest potential for achieving a normatively satisfying understanding of constitutional dialogue emerges when the contributions of equilibrium and partnership theories of dialogue are synthesized. Wow. Now, how many of you would like me to give you the name of this professor and where you can look this article up to read it? Nobody. I knew that would happen. I give you my guarantee I've read enough. There is no way I will read this article. All I know for sure is that I will pay money if need be, large sums of money, to ensure that I will never be forced to read this article. If I live to be 300, I will never read this article. 400, I might. You see what's wrong with this kind of thing. I don't need to even explain what's so ridiculous about this sort of writing. But you need to guard your heart against this sort of abuse because you are graduate students, right? And graduate students are forced more perhaps than most of us to spend lots of time listening to professors who talk this way and reading things written by professors and other highfalutin, self-styled intellectuals and other eggheads who write this way. Heaven help us. I apologize on behalf of the academic world. It's inexcusable, this sort of writing, this sort of mumbo-jumbo. Even giving her generous credit for the fact that she's writing about a subject involving an inherent measure of abstraction and theorizing, there's no ever any good excuse for trying to talk this way. It comes from all of the worst motives. Well, let's see what we'll do now. We've got 5 minutes left. Can we put that videotape on now? I'll do this. I have no intent. I'm done with the lecture part of this presentation. I thought what I'd do, 1 second. You are all obviously free to leave at any moment. You can leave at 7:30 if you wish. I won't take offense. I won't ask. No salesman will call. But for the benefit, is there anyone who wouldn't mind sticking around a little bit longer than 7:30? You wouldn't mind? Anyone? Okay. I promised God that even if there were only 5 righteous. I want to show you a short video clip of a great public speaker. His name is Johnny Cochran, the late Johnny Cochran, who passed away recently. With good reason, he was widely regarded as one of the foremost trial lawyers of his day, our day. This is the beginning of his opening statement in the defense of O.J. Simpson at the criminal trial. Just watch the first few minutes with me. You'll see his obvious strengths. And I thought we'd watch it together for a few minutes and then stop it and then briefly discuss what was good, what was not so good about the way he spoke, the way he expressed himself, subjected to a little bit of rhetorical analysis. Because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing I'm trying to encourage all of you to do. Nobody could hope to come in here in an hour and a half and help to make you a great speaker just by talking to you a little bit. What I'm trying to do, all I've tried to do here tonight, is to help you identify the kinds of questions all of us should be asking ourselves all the days of our lives as you read and listen to lots of stuff coming from great writers and speakers. I want to help you to identify the ways in which you can systematically ask yourselves the right kinds of questions. Why did I like that? Why did I not like that? Why did this move me? That's how you become better at this sort of thing. But don't get too worked up about getting better at this sort of thing because this world is just passing by, and soon enough we'll all be in glory together, and then we'll all be just as good at this as everybody else. So it's not of any permanent significance. But you want to be a Christian leader to train and to change the world. Now, it's not totally fair to the gentleman that we might try to judge this, not having given him the chance to play the whole thing. Just a beginning, I grant you that. The man is highly regarded in the legal profession. He was during his life because he's obviously smooth. He's eloquent. He's got a disarming charm that is rather obvious. What do you think about it? Any reactions? Any particularly strong parts or not so strong parts, things you liked or didn't like about what he said, his choice of words, and why? Anyone at all? Yes, you first. His rings. You found his rings distract. Anyone else notice the rings as a bit of a distraction? A lot of people saying the same thing. That's an important point about public speaking generally. You've got to be careful and conservative in matters of personal appearance, how long you wear your hair, what kind of things you wear, how many rings you wear, whether you have facial tattoos. All of these things are generally best avoided if there's any danger that even a small percentage of your listeners are likely to find them at least distracting, if not offensive. Good. What else? Yes. Mr. Ladd. Good point. Excellent. Yeah. I should, so you can, I don't want you to miss this around. I'll work the crowd here. Yeah. Tell us your name.
Melissa Dame. He made a point of saying this is the opening statement, not argument, to try and lend, I think, credibility, and he kept stressing it's a guide, this is what we expect the evidence to suggest. So I think it leads to more credibility.
A little bit of moderation. It doesn't come across as some sort of as an ideologue. Yes, good. Who else?
He admitted the limits of his own statements, and he said that they're not evidence at all. So he admitted his own, how far it can go.
Thank you.
I like that he explained his purpose in layman's terms when he first got up there and explained what an opening statement was. I thought it could have been offensive for him to say that we're going to forecast the coming attractions, as if we're in a murder trial and there was someone who was the people who were killed, using that analogy to describe his opening statement as the case as a coming attraction or something. I don't know.
I think that's an excellent observation.
Also, he used the word "we" and he praised their sacrifice for being on the jury.
Very good points. Very astute points all around. I think that one's particularly astute, though. Why would he say this is just a preview of coming attractions, as it were? I think the honest explanation, like most of us, he is to a large extent the victim of habit. He's like most trial lawyers. He's been using certain phrases for so long, they seem second nature to him. But you've always got to be careful to know your audience and to know your purpose. And remember the context. I mean, you're not seeing the context. He's getting up here, and he seems rather smooth and beguiling and charming. But remember, he's getting up second. The prosecutors have gotten up before this speech was given. Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden got up and spoke forcefully and passionately with big graphic blow-ups of color photos saying this man, Johnny Cochran's client, is a murderer who ruthlessly killed a couple of people in cold blood, carved them up like a slab of meat and left them to lie bleeding to death on the sidewalk. That was what they had been listening to, the jury, for hours. And for him, against that background, to get up, you can understand why he's trying to settle the jury down, to sort of diffuse their excitement. But to say in that context, well, what I've got to say is sort of like a preview of coming attractions, is that you're exactly right. It's probably a choice of words that would have been better avoided in a case of such obvious sensationalism. Yes, back here.
I wanted to comment on her comment regarding praising them. It seemed that he used the praise to help them understand their role as opposed to overwhelming them with the severity of what they were doing. He praised them for being on the jury versus making them scared for the fact that they have to make a decision in this. So. Sure.
And an expression of gratitude will certainly go a long way toward helping any of your audiences to establish a bit of rapport with the audience, to show that I really am grateful, as I did, I suppose, when I came in here tonight and I said, gosh, so pleased to see any of you coming out on a night like this when you don't have to be here. I meant that sincerely, but it was my effort to try to establish a measure of gratitude. Although, honestly, I question whether maybe he overdid it or did it in the best way. When he kept saying to them, well, we've been here for months now, owing, he said, largely to the unprecedented largesse of Judge Ito. I mean, is largesse a word you think these jurors are? Largesse, it's one word. No. You think this is a word that these jurors are accustomed to using or hearing or reading? I don't think so. It is an eloquent word, maybe. I mean, there's a place for eloquence, perhaps, I'm sure. Some of you know from time to time I've been rumored to use words in public settings that are designed to test and to gradually, lovingly expand the working functional lexicon of my audiences. But I'm a teacher. I'm not here to impress any of you or to win your affection. I'm here to help you become better communicators. So if I can use a few extra words that you don't hear every day and thereby expand the limits of your erudition by my example, so be it. But that's not what he's supposed to be doing. And using words that your audience is not likely to be familiar with can only create psychological distance between you and them. So I cut out the largesse and as it were and those sorts of things. Although, to his credit, he doesn't do that as badly as most lawyers do. What about his quote of Cicero? Remember, just before we stopped, he quoted Cicero? Can anybody here for $1 repeat word for word what Cicero said? What did Cicero say? Well, I like the way you put it better than Cicero. He says, he who violates his oath profanes the divinity of faith itself. I don't even know what that means. I really don't. I've been thinking about it for 3 years. I really don't know what it means. Maybe it lost something in the translation from Greek to English. I'm not blaming Cicero. But he who violates his oath profanes the divinity of faith itself? I like the way you put it better. The English translation that you just shared with us made a whole lot more sense, I think, and that's what he should have given us instead. And when you go around quoting Cicero in front of a bunch of people who don't probably make it their daily custom, to quote Cicero, the downside, of course, is you run the risk that they perceive you're just trying to flaunt your seeming sophistication and erudition, which is not generally an effective element of persuasive rhetoric. What else? Any other comments? These are very interesting to me. Back here.
He kept mentioning how everyone was to go back to the facts. So I was thinking of the glove then.
Hey, by the way, did you hear his closing argument or any part of it? Do you remember any of the lines? It went on for 4 hours. And what's the one line we all remember? If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Nice and simple, almost all one syllable long. Good point. Thank you. Hey, what else? Back here.
He accomplished a lot in just, I would say, 5 minutes or so. He took on the posture of storyteller. He also kept some of the gravity of the moment and severity of what they're trying. And also, I agree with what Amy said, but he also did put some onus on the jury and some weight and some gravity on their shoulders.
What do you think, though? Here's the thought. I'll get to the others in a moment. Several of you have commented on the sensible and effective way in which he tried to express his gratitude for the jury service. I agree, that's a good idea. But what about his choice to actually remind them, we've been together for months already, and we barely started, and we're likely to be together for months yet to come. And during that time, you'll be sequestered, as it were. That means kept away from your family. And if you can reach a verdict, he said, we hope that your verdict, if you are able to reach one, reminding the jury that it might all be for vain. We might end up with a hung jury, and you might have to get out of here never even having settled the case. Is that really the right time to be reminding them that they're likely to be sitting there for that long? I mean, granted, it's something you can't deny, but is this a pleasant thought, you think, for the jury at that particular moment? What else? Yes.
I think what he was doing a lot is a little bit of misdirection and sleight of hand, because the day before, as you were saying, the prosecution were very graphic and very directed at O.J. Simpson, but he took it completely away from the defendant. He completely put the onus and everything that he was talking about was about something else.
That's excellent. I'm interrupting you. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. You're right about that. Look how long this guy was able to talk in the so-called trial of the century without saying one word about my client or his name or if he's guilty or innocent. Was that a good idea? But why would he do such a thing? Or was it perhaps a bad idea? The ironic thing is, I won't play the whole tape now, because then you'd be sequestered, as it were, for months. But the ironic thing is, about 4 minutes after the point where I stopped, 4 or 5 minutes later, when he finally finished all this omnibus palaver, I mean, everything he said practically here could have been used at the beginning of an opening statement in any case. When he finally got down to the facts of this case, one of the very first things he said about this case was, we will prove, and the proof will show, that O.J. Simpson is an innocent man who has been wrongly convicted, who has already been in prison for a crime that he did not commit. Now, I don't know about you, but I submit to you that if I were the defense attorney in a case like this, but I know that the jury's been listening to 5 hours of steady and provocative accusations by the prosecution, I don't think I'd want to wait 8 minutes to get around to telling the jury, oh, by the way, this guy, he didn't do it. He's innocent. You think O.J. would wait 8 minutes if he had been forced to represent himself? You think O.J.'s brother, if forced to represent O.J., would take 8 minutes to get around to telling the jury, oh, by the way, everything they said, we deny it all for the record? I think that the jury's expectations are likely, as good as this was, I don't know. I fear that it may have been held against him to some extent, by some of the jurors at least, that, I mean, they're waiting for him to respond to these accusations that they've been hearing, and look how long he takes winding up round and round the barn, talking about the justice system and Cicero and Lincoln and Abraham and Martin and John. It's an open question whether that really is the most effective way of communicating with an audience that is likely to be, remember, you know that you've got to know their expectations. They want to hear from you. We've been waiting for months, years. Did he do it or not? What do you have to say about this particular subject? If some of the jurors perceive that he was, as you say, trying to get them to take their eye off the ball, you know, they might have reacted adversely to that perception. You have a comment, sir?
Yeah, I take a different perspective in that, first of all, there's a lot of tension. As you mentioned earlier, he had to cut through that. And secondly, which is, I think, far more important, is he has to make the connection with the jurors. I think he understood, he knew the backgrounds of the jurors. So he had to lay the ground rules. He had to cite and make quotes so as to make that connection. And I think once he realized that he made the connection with the jurors, because you can see that feedback, then he went in with his message. But I thought it was crucial for him to lay that groundwork first. I think if he went in within the first sentence said that, hey, my client is not guilty, I think he would not, the word would not get through. So I think he had to diffuse the tension and then make the connection with the individual jurors. And he had to do that several different ways, and making quotes, because everybody knows Cicero. May not know what he has said, but they know. So it doesn't matter what was said in the opening remarks. I think not so, but people will remember that, yes, Cicero, and establish that connection, so that he was able to get his message across.
Oh, I don't disagree with you. Not nearly so much as I may have mistakenly given you cause to suspect. That was well stated. Yeah, definitely, yes. Yes. Over here, pass this down.
I think that's interesting, but I actually had the exact opposite response. I found him to be somewhat grandiose by referring to Cicero and Lincoln. And I thought, as a listener, if I had been a juror, that would have raised my suspicions as his attempt to try to placate and lull me. And the other thing that I found I was responding to was the fact that even though he was saying he was respecting the jurors and appreciating them, he seemed to be enjoying his own sort of theatrical effort. And I found that by the length of time he took to talk, he was actually disrespecting the jurors. So that was my outcome or response.
Well, public speaking is a matter of playing the odds. It's not at all uncommon that different people will have idiosyncratic and differing subjective interpretations of the same thing, or totally opposite reactions. So the challenge for Johnny Cochran and for the rest of us, all of us, is to try to weigh these competing concerns, as you so eloquently put it, trying to establish a measure of rapport with the jury and trying to make them understand that he was a man of some sobriety and understanding, and at the same time being careful not to tax their patience a little bit too much, which is, as you say, especially ironic in the context of a fellow who so many times was alluding to how long this has taken and how long yet it may take, and we're really sorry it will, but we appreciate that you're willing to put up with the process that it'll take so long. That's all well and good, unless, heaven forbid, you cross over the line where the jury starts to think, well, for goodness sake, will you stop talking about how much of our time you're wasting and get on with it? Whether he actually crossed that line, reasonable people will disagree. We'll take one more comment. Yes? A question.
Just because some of us want else have the moot court about to come up, I just wanted to know, since we'd be arguing before a judge, how much different is that, so we're not embarrassed when, the Supreme Justice or whatever of the Virginia court comes in?
Or worse. Well, you know what I'll do? I will. I'll answer that question very briefly. Because unfortunately, I can't give you the 1-0 moot court competition. You're not expected to sound or look like Johnny Cochran, because he's a trial lawyer talking in front of a bunch of jurors, and that raises it's a unique sitting. It's an unusual situation. It's a very special rhetorical challenge, given the nature of his audience and their expectations and his conflicting interests and objectives that have been so nicely identified by folks here today. The 1L moot court competition is designed, as I recall, back in my day, the 1L moot court competition, it's designed to simulate an appellate argument, right? Is that still true? You're not talking to a jury about the facts and any homespun humor and Cicero and Mark Twain, and as I recall, it was Will Rogers. No. You're there to answer questions from the judges about the law. So it much less resembles this sort of thing than the sort of thing you were expected to do in a law school. Stand up straight, have a suit and a tie, and look them in the eye, yes sir, no sir, answer their questions. They'll ask you questions about cases and facts and principles and hypotheses, and you're expected to dazzle them with your analytical brilliance and your command of the facts and the law. So it's question and answer, much more than this. The fact that it's a courtroom proceeding means that it has only the shallowest and superficial similarity to the trial process we just saw a moment ago. There's a little bit of the differences in a nutshell. But I will give you one else. and other future lawyers, I will give you a one-sentence, wonderful bit of advice, the best bit of advice anybody could ever give you for participating in the moot court or in the real world in an appellate argument. Try to make sure that every answer, when you get a question from a judge, let every answer out of your mouth begin with yes or no. Yes, or write those words down. Let your yes be yes. Let your no be no. Don't go with this big wind-up. Don't say, Your Honor, that's a provocative question, one that tests the limit of our understanding. I believe it was Wigmore 600 years ago who first... They'll cut you off every time they get tired. They don't know how long this will take. They don't want to hear it. They'll cut you off, and you'll find yourself again and again saying, I wish I had said something. I wish I had said something. Don't presume in an appellate argument that you will be given carte blanche to go on as long as you want, or even to finish the first sentence. You probably usually won't. So get right to the point. Say yes, because. No, because. You'll be glad every time you did. You'll be glad that you did. I'll resist the temptation to go further. Well, listen, we've got to stop. It's getting late. I'm glad you came out. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something from it. I've learned from you. I've enjoyed spending a little time with you. God bless you. And for those of you who don't have to run out right this second, why don't we just take less than a minute so that I can pray for you. Praise God. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Father in heaven, I give you thanks again this day for the supernatural ways in which you continue to manifest your hand at work by drawing from all over this country these wonderful young men and women called to this place with a burning desire to be used by you and to serve you, Lord God, as Christian leaders to change the world. I pray for them and for their faculty as we pray now for each other, Lord, that as iron sharpens iron, Lord, that each of us can sharpen each other to become more effective instruments of your justice, your love, your mercy, your reconciliation, your plan of salvation for this world. We pray, Lord, that every one of us, myself especially, can become more effective communicators so that the words of our mouths can be pleasing in your sight and a source of enlightenment, enrichment, encouragement, inspiration, exhortation, edification, blessing for all those you bring, oh God, into our lives. We dedicate ourselves now and always to your service in Jesus' name. Amen. Good night.